The ice cracked like gunshot beneath Eliza Morrison's boots as she dragged herself toward the riverbank, her swollen belly making every step a trial. Blood steamed against the snow where she'd fallen, her knuckles scraped raw from clawing at the frozen ground. The man she'd pulled from the water hung limp in her arms, his lips blue as winter sky breath, coming in desperate whispers that clouded the bitter air. She should have kept walking. Should have ignored his cries echoing across the frozen wasteland. But the sound had pierced through her, like a memory she couldn't shake, the same desperate plea she'd made 3 months ago, when Marcus Thornfield's fists had left her gasping on their kitchen floor, her unborn child, the only thing keeping her from giving up entirely. "Please," the stranger had gasped through chattering teeth. "Don't let me die like this." The same words she'd whispered to an empty room as Thornfield's heavy footsteps had echoed down the hallway, coming back for more. The same prayer she'd breathed as she'd gathered what little she owned and fled into the night, choosing the unknown dangers of the frontier over the certain brutality of the man who called himself her husband. Now 300 yards from the abandoned mining camp at Copper Creek, she felt eyes watching from the tree line. The sensation crawled up her spine like ice water, making her pause despite the dying man's weight in her arms. Steam rose from his wet clothes in the frigid air, and she could feel his life slipping away with each labored breath. A rifle crack split the winter silence. Bark exploded from the pine beside her head, showering her with splinters. Eliza threw herself sideways, sheltering the stranger's body with her own. As another shot whistled past so close, she felt the heat of its passage. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she half-carried, half-dragged the unconscious man behind the shelter of a massive boulder. Blood spotted the snow where they'd been standing. Not his blood, hers. The bullet had grazed her shoulder, tearing through her coat to leave a burning line across her flesh. She pressed her back against the stone, feeling the baby kick frantically inside her, as if sensing the danger. Silence stretched across the frozen landscape, broken only by the distant sound of ice settling on the river. Someone had tried to kill them both, and they were still out there waiting. The weight of the stranger's body against her side reminded her that she wasn't just fighting for her own life anymore. She was fighting for 3. The wind carried the scent of wood smoke from the direction of the mining camp, promising shelter if she could reach it. But between here and safety lay 200 yards of open ground. And somewhere in those trees, a marksman waited with patience, carved from winter itself. Eliza Morrison had run from one kind of predator, only to find herself prey to another. But as her hand moved protectively over her belly, feeling the strong kicks of the child growing inside her, she made a promise that would define everything that followed. Whatever happened, whatever it cost, she would not let them become victims again. The man in her arms stirred, his eyes fluttering open to reveal deep brown irises, clouded with pain and confusion. "Where?" he whispered, then stopped as understanding dawned. "You saved me." "We're not saved yet," Eliza replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Someone's hunting us." She didn't know it then, but those words would prove more prophetic than she could imagine. In the shadows of the mining camp ahead, other figures moved with purpose. The game had already begun, and the rules were simple: survive, or become another story the winter wind would carry away with the snow. The abandoned mining buildings of Copper Creek squatted against the mountainside, like weathered tombstones, their windows dark and lifeless in the fading afternoon light. Eliza had discovered this place 2 weeks ago, while fleeing north from Thornfield's ranch, following rumors of a settlement where a woman might disappear without questions asked. What she'd found instead was a ghost town, its copper mine sealed after a cave-in 5 years earlier that had claimed 16 lives. But ghosts didn't leave fresh boot prints in the snow. She'd noticed them 3 days ago, tracks that appeared overnight around the perimeter of the camp, always in different places, always carefully positioned where someone keeping watch might spot them. At first, she'd told herself it was her imagination, paranoia, born from months of living in terror. But the tracks were real, and they were getting closer. The main camp consisted of 7 buildings, a general store with sagging shelves, a saloon with tables still set, as if waiting for customers who would never return workers' quarters that smelled of mildew and decay. And at the center, a 2-story structure that had once served as the mine supervisor's residence. This last building, with its stone foundation and reinforced walls, had become her refuge. She'd chosen the upper floor for its vantage point and defensible position, barricading the stairs with heavy furniture and keeping her few possessions packed for quick escape. The windows faced in all 4 directions, giving her clear sight lines across the camp and into the surrounding forest. Most importantly, the building backed against the mountainside with a sealed mine entrance just 50 yards away, a bolt hole if she needed to run. But running was becoming impossible. The baby had grown heavy inside her, slowing her movements and sapping her strength. Henley and Millfield had told her she had perhaps 3 weeks left, maybe less, if the stress and poor nutrition took their toll. She couldn't outrun riders anymore, couldn't climb the treacherous mountain paths that might offer escape. She needed to make a stand here in this place of the dead. The man she'd pulled from the river lay unconscious on the supervisor's bed, wrapped in every blanket she could find. He was tall and lean, with the weathered hands of someone who worked outdoors and a face marked by sun and wind. His clothes were good quality, but practical wool shirt, leather vest, boots that had seen hard use but were well maintained. Most telling was the gun belt he wore, worn leather, with the subtle modifications that marked a man comfortable with violence. She'd found no identification in his pockets, just a handful of coins, a folding knife with a bone handle, and something that made her stomach tighten, a small pouch of gold dust worth more than most men saw in a year. Men carried that kind of money for 2 reasons: they were very successful or they were very dangerous. As she tended his wounds with supplies scavenged from the camp's abandoned medical kit, she studied his face for clues to his character. High cheekbones and a strong jaw suggested resilience. But there was something else, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of secrets carried and prices paid. Scars marked his hands and forearms, some old and faded, others more recent. This was a man who had survived violence, perhaps dealt it in return. The question that haunted her as darkness fell was simple. Had she saved an ally or invited a wolf into her sanctuary? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending snow spiraling past the glass. Somewhere in that swirling white darkness, her watchers remained patient. She could feel them out there, waiting for her to make a mistake, to show weakness, to give them the opening they needed. Her hand moved to the small revolver, tucked into her belt, a wedding gift from Thornfield that she'd taken when she fled. She'd learned to use it during those long, fearful months of marriage, practicing in secret while he was away on business. The weight of it against her hip was both comfort and reminder she would not be helpless again. The baby kicked, and she placed her other hand over her belly, feeling the strong movement beneath her palm. This child would be born free, away from Thornfield's rage and control. Whatever it took, whatever prices had to be paid, she would ensure that much. The unconscious man stirred, mumbling words she couldn't understand. In his delirium, he seemed to be arguing with someone, his voice tight with what sounded like regret. Once, distinctly, she heard him say a name: Pike. The word was spoken with such venom that it made her shiver despite the warmth from the fireplace. As the hours passed and the storm intensified, Eliza Morrison kept her vigil by the window, watching for movement in the snow-swept camp below. She didn't know that in the darkness beyond her sight, plans were already in motion. Didn't know that the man she'd saved carried secrets that would change everything. Didn't know that by dawn, the fragile piece of Copper Creek would be shattered forever. What she did know, with the certainty that comes from surviving betrayal and brutality, was that the watchers in the woods were not the only predators she needed to fear. The most dangerous hunters often wore the faces of those we trust. Morning brought no relief from the storm, only a strange girl stumbling through the snow-drifted camp like a lost spirit. Eliza spotted her from the upper window, a small figure in a tattered coat, moving with the desperate urgency of someone fleeing death itself. The girl couldn't be more than 15, with long dark hair, whipping around a face pale with exhaustion and fear. Against every instinct screaming at her to stay hidden, Eliza found herself moving toward the door. Something about the girl's stumbling gait reminded her of herself 3 months ago, broken, desperate, with nowhere left to run. By the time rational thought caught up with compassion, she was already calling out from the porch. "Here, this way." The girl's head snapped up, and even from a distance, Eliza could see the relief that flooded her features. She half ran, half fell toward the supervisor's house, and Eliza caught her as she collapsed on the front steps. "Thank God." The girl gasped, her voice rough with cold. I thought I was going to die out there." Up close, she was even younger than Eliza had estimated, with the kind of beauty that would have made her a target in the rough frontier towns. But her eyes held shadows that spoke of terrible experiences, and when Eliza helped her inside, she moved with the careful, controlled motions of someone expecting pain. "I'm Jessie," she said once she was settled by the fire with a cup of hot coffee. "Jessie Wade. I've been walking for 2 days." "Walking from where?" Eliza asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "Dead Horse." Jessie's voice dropped to a whisper. "There's a man there. Sheriff Pike. He's been—" She stopped, her hands trembling as she wrapped them around the tin cup. "He does things to girls like me. Takes us for his games." The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. She'd heard whispers about Dead Horse, a town 2 days' ride south, where the law existed only to serve the powerful and the corrupt. But to hear it confirmed, to see the evidence written in the fear etched across this girl's face, made her stomach clench with familiar dread. "You're safe now," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Safety was an illusion she'd lost faith in long ago. "What kind of games?" Jessie's laugh was bitter beyond her years. "He calls it hunting. Takes people, girls, drifters, anyone who won't be missed, and turns them loose in the mountains. Gives them a head start, then comes after them with his men. Some he brings back alive. Most he doesn't." The coffee cup slipped from Eliza's nerveless fingers, shattering on the wooden floor. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence, and she felt the blood drain from her face as understanding crashed over her. "The tracks," she whispered. "The watchers in the woods." Jessie nodded miserably. "He followed me. I tried to lose him in the storm, but Pike, he's good at this. Real good. Been doing it for years." From the bedroom came the sound of movement their patient was finally stirring. Eliza heard him groan, followed by the creak of bed springs as he tried to sit up. She needed to check on him, but Jessie's next words froze her in place. "There's something else," the girl said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "The man you pulled from the river. I saw him before in Dead Horse. He was with Pike's men." The world seemed to tilt around Eliza as the implications sank in. The stranger she'd risked her life to save the man she'd brought into her sanctuary might be one of them. Might be bait in whatever twisted game Pike was playing. "Are you sure?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The expensive clothes, the gold dust, the scars that spoke of violence, it all fit. "I'm sure." Jessie's eyes were hard with remembered fear. "His name is Nate something. Nathan, maybe. Pike called him his best tracker." The sound of footsteps on the stairs made them both turn. The man they'd been discussing appeared in the doorway, still pale, but clearly conscious. His dark eyes moved between them, taking in their faces, reading the tension in their postures, with the skill of someone trained to assess danger. "Ladies?" he said quietly, his voice hoarse but steady. Sounds like we need to talk. And in that moment, as three desperate souls faced each other in the lamplight, while the storm raged outside, Eliza Morrison realized that her nightmare was just beginning. The predators hadn't been hunting her, they'd been herding her, driving her toward this moment, this place, this terrible convergence of secrets and lies. The game Pike had spoken of wasn't starting. It had been playing all along, and she'd been a piece on the board from the very beginning. Nathan Cross, for that was the name he gave them, once the pretense was abandoned, sat heavily in the wooden chair by the fire. His hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he spoke. The confession came slowly, painfully, like drawing poison from a wound. Pike found me in Laramie 3 years ago. He said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was drunk, broke, and wanted for murder in 2 territories. He offered me a choice: work for him or hang. Eliza sat across from him, her hand resting protectively on her belly, studying his face for signs of deception. Jessie had withdrawn to the far corner of the room, her young features tight with remembered fear and present suspicion. What kind of work? Eliza asked, though she dreaded the answer. Nate's laugh was bitter. Tracking mostly, finding people who didn't want to be found, bringing them back alive, if possible dead if necessary. Pike pays well for that kind of service. And the games, Jessie's hunting parties, I never participated in those. His voice carried the weight of conviction, but also something else, shame perhaps, or regret. Pike has other men for that. Men who enjoy it. I just found people and brought them in. Jessie spoke from her corner, her voice sharp with accusation. You knew what happened to them afterward. Yes. The single word hung in the air like a judgment. I knew. Eliza felt the baby kick, a strong reminder of what she was fighting for. Then why help me now? Why risk your life pulling you from that river? Nate was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying fire. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, more vulnerable. Because I was trying to get away from him. Had been for months. Pike doesn't let people leave his organization easily. Too many secrets, too much at stake. So I've been planning, saving money, looking for the right moment. He looked up at her then, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch genuine remorse, and something that might have been hope. The river wasn't an accident. I was running when the ice gave way. 3 of Pike's men were chasing me, and I figured drowning was better than what they'd do if they caught me alive. But they didn't catch you, Jessie said. We did. And now they know where I am. Nate's expression grew grim. The gunshot you heard when you pulled me out, that was them. They saw you save me, which means they know about this place, know you're helping me. Eliza felt ice form in her stomach. Which means we're all targets now. I'm afraid so. Nate stood, moving to the window, with the careful steps of a man still recovering from near death. Pike doesn't leave loose ends, and 3 fugitives holed up in an abandoned mining camp. To him, that's not a problem to be solved. It's an opportunity to be exploited. As if summoned by his words, a sound drifted across the camp from outside, the distant whinny of horses carried on the wind. All 3 of them froze, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the creak of leather and the soft jingle of bit chains. How many? Eliza whispered. Nate peered carefully through the frost-covered glass. I count 4 riders. Maybe more staying back in the trees. Pike's men? Jessie asked, though her voice already carried the certainty of fear. Has to be. They're not here for a social call. The horses grew closer, and now they could hear voices low, conversational, supremely confident. These were men who expected no resistance, who saw the capture of 3 desperate fugitives as nothing more than routine work. Eliza's hand found the revolver at her hip, drawing it with movements that surprised her with their steadiness. Beside her, Nate checked his own weapon, a heavy Colt that looked well used and carefully maintained. "There's a back way out," she said quietly. "Through the kitchen, then, across to the mine entrance." "If we can reach the tunnels." "No." Nate's voice was firm. "Pike knows these mountains. He'll have men covering every exit, every trail. Running just plays into his hands." "Then what do you suggest?" Jesse's voice cracked with the strain of holding back tears. Before Nate could answer, a new voice cut through the storm, loud, commanding, filled with the easy confidence of a man who held all the cards. "Nathan Cross." The shout echoed across the camp, bouncing off the weathered buildings. "I know you're in there, boy. Time to come home." Pike had arrived. Through the window, they could see him now, a tall figure in a dark coat sitting easy in his saddle despite the wind and snow. Even at a distance, there was something about his posture that spoke of absolute authority, the kind of presence that bent others to his will, through force of personality alone. "You've got 10 minutes to send him out." Pike called, his voice carrying easily through the storm. "After that, things get unpleasant for everyone involved." "What does he want?" Eliza whispered. Nate's face was grim. "Me, obviously. But Pike's not the type to waste an opportunity. He's probably already planning how to use you and Jesse in his next game." Jesse made a small, frightened sound. "We can't let him take us back there. You don't know what he does to the ones who try to run." The baby kicked hard and Eliza gasped, one hand flying to her belly. The movement was sharp enough to make both her companions look at her with concern. "How long?" Nate asked quietly. "Soon," she admitted. "Maybe days, maybe hours." "Jesus." He ran a hand through his dark hair, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a stone. "Pike can't know about the baby. If he finds out—" "What?" Eliza demanded. "What happens if he finds out?" Nate's silence was answer enough. Outside, Pike's voice rose again, but this time there was something different in his tone, a dark amusement that made Eliza's skin crawl. "I know there's a lady in there with you, Nathan. And a young miss, too, if I'm not mistaken. Would be a shame if something happened to them because of your stubbornness." The threat hung in the air, like smoke acrid and choking. Eliza looked at her companions, a broken outlaw, seeking redemption, a terrified girl who'd already endured too much, and herself heavy with child, and running from one monster only to face another. In that moment, as Pike's laughter echoed across the snow-covered camp, she made a decision that would define everything that followed. She would not be a victim again. Not for Pike, not for anyone. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, she would fight. The game Pike wanted to play had rules, but Eliza Morrison was about to change them. The attack came at dawn, just as the storm began to break. Eliza woke to the acrid smell of smoke and the sound of crackling flames eating at the wooden walls below. Through the bedroom window, she could see orange light dancing against the snow, and she knew immediately what Pike had done. "Fire!" she shouted, shaking Nate and Jesse awake. "He's burning us out." The smoke was already thickening in the air, seeping up through the floorboards from the lower level. Pike had set the building ablaze, cutting off their main escape route and forcing them to face a terrible choice: burn alive or walk into his trap. Nate was on his feet instantly, moving to the window, with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to violence. "I count 6 men positioned around the camp. They're staying back, letting the fire do their work." "The back stairs," Eliza said, coughing as the smoke grew thicker. "We can still reach them if we move now." But when they rushed to the rear of the building, they found their path blocked by a wall of flame. Pike had been thorough, and the entire lower level was burning, the old dry wood catching like tinder. The fire climbed the walls with hungry efficiency, filling the air with choking smoke and unbearable heat. Windows. Jessie gasped, pressing a cloth to her face. "We have to jump." The drop from the second floor was 20 feet onto hard-packed snow and scattered debris. Survivable but risky, especially for a woman in Eliza's condition. As if sensing her thoughts, the baby kicked frantically, responding to her elevated heartbeat and the stress chemicals flooding her system. "I can't," she admitted, one hand pressed to her belly. The fall could kill the baby. Nate's jaw was set in grim determination. "Then we make a rope. Bed sheets, curtains, anything we can tie together." They worked frantically, stripping the bed and tearing down the heavy drapes that had covered the windows. The smoke was getting worse, burning their eyes and throats, making it hard to see or breathe. Below them, the flames roared with increasing intensity, and they could hear the groan of stressed timbers beginning to fail. As Nate secured their improvised rope to the heavy bed frame, Eliza heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of Pike's voice, calling out from somewhere in the camp. "Getting warm in there yet, Nathan? You've got about 5 minutes before that floor gives way. Might want to hurry." The rope was crude but functional, made from twisted sheets and secured with knots that would have to hold their combined weight. Nate tested it carefully, then turned to help Eliza toward the window. "Ladies first," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "No." Eliza's voice was firm. "Jessie goes first. She's smallest, and if the rope doesn't hold..." Jessie was already moving, swinging her leg over the windowsill with the desperate agility of youth. She rappelled down quickly, her boots scraping against the building's stone foundation as she descended. Within moments, she was on the ground, waving frantically for them to follow. Eliza went next, Nate's strong hands supporting her as she maneuvered her swollen body through the narrow window. The descent was terrifying, 20 feet of rope and faith, with the ground seeming impossibly far below. Halfway down, she felt the baby shift inside her, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she might lose her grip. But then Jessie was there to steady her landing, and Nate was sliding down behind them, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man comfortable with danger. They were all on the ground, all alive, but their relief was short-lived. Pike's men had been waiting. They emerged from the shadows of the surrounding buildings like wolves closing on wounded prey. 6 men on horseback, faces hidden by hats and bandanas, rifles trained on the 3 fugitives huddled in the snow. At their head rode Pike himself, a tall man with steel-gray hair and eyes like winter frost. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of an educated man who had chosen to embrace brutality. "The rats finally leave the burning ship." Up close, Pike was even more intimidating than his voice had suggested. He sat his horse with casual authority, one gloved hand resting on the pommel of his saddle, while the other held a lever-action rifle with practiced ease. His face was weathered but aristocratic, with the kind of sharp features that suggested both intelligence and cruelty. "Hello, Nathan." Pike continued his tone, almost conversational. "You've led us quite a chase. Cost me 3 good men and a considerable amount of time." Nate stepped forward, positioning himself between Pike and the 2 women. "Let them go, Sheriff. This is between you and me." Pike's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh, I'm afraid it's far too late for that. You see, by involving these lovely ladies in your escape attempt, you've made them part of the game. And the game, as you well know, has very specific rules." He gestured to his men, who immediately began dismounting and moving to surround the 3 fugitives. Eliza noticed that they moved with military precision, spacing themselves to eliminate any chance of escape, while maintaining clear fields of fire. "What do you want?" Eliza asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Pike turned his attention to her, his cold eyes taking in her condition with obvious interest. Ah, the lady speaks. And what a lady she is expecting, if I'm not mistaken. How fascinating. The way he said it made Eliza's skin crawl. There was something predatory in his gaze, something that spoke of terrible possibilities she didn't want to contemplate. "You're Eliza Morrison," Pike continued, and her blood turned to ice. "Or should I say, Eliza Thornfield? Yes, I know who you are. Marcus put quite a price on your head, dead or alive, though he expressed a preference for alive. Something about wanting to handle your punishment personally." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Thornfield had found her, had hired Pike to bring her back. All her running, all her careful hiding had been for nothing. And young Jessie here. Pike went on, his attention shifting to the girl who stood trembling beside Eliza. One of my recent acquisitions, who showed such poor judgment in trying to leave without permission. "Please," Jessie whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I won't run again. I'll do whatever you want." "Oh, my dear child," Pike said, his voice sickeningly gentle. "You already are doing exactly what I want. You see, this little reunion isn't the end of the game. It's the beginning of the most exciting version yet." He dismounted, then walking toward them with the confident stride of a man who held absolute power over life and death. His men maintained their positions, weapons ready. But Pike seemed completely at ease despite being outnumbered 3-1 by his captives. "Here's how this works," he said, stopping just out of arm's reach. "The three of you are going to play a new kind of hunting game. One that I've been planning for some time." He reached into his coat and withdrew a large hunting knife, its blade gleaming in the light from the burning building behind them. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed it at Eliza's feet, where it stuck point first in the frozen ground. "The rules are simple," Pike continued. "You have until sunrise tomorrow to reach the old copper mine on Devil's Peak that's about 15 miles north of here, through some of the roughest country in the territory. Along the way, my men and I will be hunting you." Eliza stared at the knife, her mind reeling. "What's the catch?" Pike's smile was colder than the mountain wind. "Oh, there are several. First, only one of you can reach the mine alive. The other two must die along the way by my men's bullets, by the elements, or by each other's hand. Makes no difference to me." Jessie made a choking sound, and Nate's fists clenched at his sides. But Pike wasn't finished. "Second, if more than one person reaches the mine, or if no one reaches it by sunrise, then I collect the bounty on all three of you, and Marcus Thornfield gets his wife back in whatever condition I see fit to deliver her." "You're insane," Nate said quietly. "I'm thorough," Pike corrected. "This game serves multiple purposes. It eliminates 3 problems, simultaneously provides entertainment for my men, and allows me to test some new hunting techniques I've been developing." Eliza looked at the knife again, then at her companions. Jessie was barely standing, kept upright, only by terror and desperation. Nate's face was carved from stone, but she could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, calculating odds and possibilities. "What if we refuse to play?" she asked. Pike's expression didn't change, but something dark flickered in his eyes. "Then I kill you all right here, right now, and tell Marcus that his wife died resisting arrest. The bounty is lower for a corpse, but still quite respectable." The baby kicked hard, and Eliza gasped, one hand flying to her belly. The movement was stronger than usual, almost painful, and she wondered if the stress was triggering early labor. "Time's wasting," Pike said, checking a pocket watch with theatrical precision. "You have 30 seconds to decide, play the game, and have a chance at survival, or die here in the snow like animals." Eliza bent down and picked up the knife. The weight of it in her hand was strange, heavier than her revolver, more intimate somehow. This was a weapon that required closeness, commitment. If she was going to use it, she would have to look her victim in the eyes. "Smart girl," Pike said approvingly. "Now, before you go, there's one more rule you should know about." Eliza looked up at him, dreading what was coming next. "The winner, the sole survivor who reaches Devil's Peak, gets more than just their life. They get their freedom, a clean slate, and enough gold to start over anywhere they choose. But most importantly, they get the satisfaction of knowing they were strong enough to do what survival required." He remounted his horse with fluid grace, looking down at them like a king surveying his subjects. "Your head start begins now. I suggest you use it wisely." As Pike and his men melted back into the forest, Eliza Morrison stood in the snow, holding a knife that represented both salvation and damnation. Around her, the flames of the burning building painted everything in shades of orange and red, casting dancing shadows that looked like demons celebrating the beginning of hell. The game had begun. They ran north through the snow-covered wilderness, following game trails and creek beds that Nate remembered from his years tracking for Pike. The knife remained in Eliza's belt, its weight a constant reminder of the terrible choice that lay ahead. Behind them, the smoke from Copper Creek rose like a black finger against the gray sky, marking the end of whatever fragile safety they had found. For the first hour, they moved in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what Pike's game meant and how it might end. Jessie stayed close to Eliza, her young face pale with shock and disbelief. Nate ranged ahead, using his skills to find the easiest paths and watch for signs of their pursuers. It was Jessie who finally broke the silence. "He wants us to turn on each other," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "That's the point of the game, isn't it? To make us do his killing for him." "Smart girl," Nate replied without looking back. Pike's always preferred psychological warfare to direct confrontation. Why risk his own men when he can manipulate his prey into destroying themselves? Eliza paused to rest against a fallen log, her breathing labored from the difficult terrain and her condition. The baby had been active all morning, responding to her stress with increasingly strong movements that sometimes took her breath away. "So, what do we do?" she asked. "We can't all survive, but we can't just give up either." Nate stopped and turned to face them, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe we can't all survive, but we don't have to play by Pike's rules. There might be another way." "What do you mean?" Jessie asked. "Devil's Peak isn't just a random destination. There's an old mining camp up there, abandoned for years but still accessible. More importantly, there's a telegraph line that runs through the area, part of the mining company's communication network. If we could get a message out—" "To who?" Eliza interrupted. "Pike owns half the law in this territory, and the other half is too corrupt or too scared to challenge him." "Not local law," Nate said. "Federal marshals. Pike's operation crosses territorial boundaries, which makes it a federal crime. The problem is getting word to them without Pike intercepting the message." They resumed walking, following a narrow creek that wound between towering pine trees, heavy with snow. The cold was bitter, seeping through their clothes and numbing their extremities despite their exertion. Eliza's feet were already beginning to lose feeling, and she worried about what the exposure might do to the baby. "There's something else," Jessie said hesitantly. "Something I didn't tell you back at the camp." Both Eliza and Nate turned to look at her, and she flushed under their attention. "When I was in Dead Horse, I overheard Pike talking to one of his men. He was talking about a big score coming up, something about a railroad shipment and a buyer in Denver." Nate's expression sharpened with interest. "What kind of shipment?" "I don't know exactly, but it sounded like it was worth a lot of money." enough that Pike was planning to retire afterward. When? Eliza asked. Next week, I think. Maybe sooner. Nate whistled softly. If we could get that information to the marshals, along with evidence of Pike's hunting games. He'd be finished, Eliza said, understanding dawning in her voice. But how do we get evidence? And how do we survive long enough to deliver it? Before Nate could answer, the sound of distant gunfire echoed through the forest. All three of them froze, listening intently, as the shots were repeated. 3 quick reports, followed by a longer pause, then 3 more. Signal shots, Nate said grimly. Pike's letting us know the hunt has officially begun. They picked up the pace, driven by the knowledge that their pursuers were no longer content to simply follow. The terrain grew more difficult as they climbed higher into the mountains, with steep ravines and fallen trees, forcing them to make time-consuming detours. More than once, Eliza had to stop and rest her body, struggling with the demands of the climb and her pregnancy. It was during one of these rest stops that Jessie made a discovery that changed everything. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a tree that had been marked with an axe. The cuts were old, but still visible, forming a pattern that looked almost like letters. Nate examined the markings closely, his face growing pale as he deciphered their meaning. "What is it?" Eliza asked. "Trail markers," he said quietly. "Pike's been planning this hunt for a long time. These marks show the route he expects us to take, probably with ambush points marked along the way." "So he's hurting us again," Eliza said bitterly, "just like at Copper Creek." "Maybe," Nate replied, "or maybe he's given us the key to beating him at his own game." He explained his thinking as they resumed their climb. If Pike had marked the trail he expected them to follow, then they could identify his ambush points and avoid them. More importantly, they could use the markers to track his movements and perhaps turn the tables on their hunters. "It's risky," he admitted, "but it's better than walking blind into his traps." As the afternoon wore on, they found more markers, each one confirming Nate's theory about Pike's predetermined plan. The sheriff had mapped out their route with military precision, accounting for terrain weather and the likelihood that his prey would seek shelter in certain areas. But Pike had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated Nathan Cross's knowledge of his methods and overestimated his control over the game he thought he was playing. As they crested a ridge and looked down into the valley that held Devil's Peak, Eliza Morrison felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not the desperate hope of a cornered animal, but the calculated optimism of someone who had found a way to fight back. The knife at her belt still represented a terrible choice, but maybe it wouldn't be the only option they had. Behind them, smoke signals rose from the forest, and the sound of hunting horns echoed off the mountainsides. Pike's men were closing in, following the trail with the confidence of predators who believed their prey had nowhere left to run. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The revelation came at sunset, when exhaustion forced them to seek shelter in a shallow cave halfway up Devil's Peak. As Eliza tended the small fire they'd built for warmth, Jessie sat quietly in the shadows, staring at the knife that lay between them like an accusation. "I have to tell you something," the girl said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Nate looked up from where he'd been studying the trail markers they'd collected, his expression alert to the change in her tone. "What is it?" Eliza asked gently. Jessie's hands shook as she pulled something from inside her coat, a small piece of red cloth that she'd been carrying since they left Copper Creek. "This is Pike's signal," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I was supposed to plant it where you were hiding. That's how he always knew where to find you." The implications hit them like a physical blow. Pike hadn't been tracking them at all. He'd been following the signals Jessie had been leaving, guiding him to their location with the precision of a hunting dog, leading its master to game. "Jesus," Nate breathed. "How long?" "Since the beginning." Jesse sobbed. He had my mother. Said he'd kill her if I didn't help him find you. But I swear I never knew about the game, never knew what he was really planning. Eliza felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath her feet. Everything they'd endured, every narrow escape, had been orchestrated by Pike using this terrified girl as his instrument. "Where's your mother now?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Dead horse. At least that's where Pike said he was keeping her. But I don't even know if she's still alive." Nate was studying the red cloth with the clinical interest of a professional tracker. "How were you supposed to signal him just by leaving this somewhere visible?" Jesse nodded miserably. Different patterns meant different things. One piece meant you were staying put, 2 pieces meant you were moving, 3 meant you were preparing to run. And if you didn't signal at all, he'd assume you were dead and come looking for the bodies. Eliza closed her eyes, feeling the weight of betrayal settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She'd trusted this girl, risked her life and her baby's life to help her, only to discover that Jesse had been Pike's weapon all along. But as she looked at the girl's tear-stained face, she saw something that gave her pause, genuine remorse, and the kind of desperate hope that came from finally telling the truth after living with a terrible secret. "Why tell us now?" she asked. "Because I can't do it anymore," Jesse said. "I can't keep helping him hunt people who've been kind to me. And because—" She hesitated, then continued in a rush. "Because maybe there's still a way to save my mother and stop Pike at the same time." Nate leaned forward, interested despite his anger. "What do you mean?" "The telegraph line you mentioned. Pike doesn't know I know about it, but I overheard him talking to one of his men. They're not just using it to coordinate the hunt, they're using it to communicate with their buyer in Denver about the railroad job. So, if we could intercept those communications, we'd have evidence of the whole operation." Eliza finished. "Not just the hunting games, but the robbery too." Jesse nodded eagerly. "And I know the schedule. Pike's supposed to send a final confirmation tomorrow night right before the hunt ends. If we could be there when he does it, we could turn his own evidence against him." Nate said, his voice growing excited. "But it would mean getting to the telegraph station before Pike realizes you've stopped signaling him." Eliza looked at the knife lying between them, then at her 2 companions, a broken outlaw seeking redemption, and a frightened girl trying to save her mother. The game Pike had designed to destroy them might instead become the instrument of his downfall. "How far to the telegraph station?" she asked. 2 miles, Nate replied. "But it's in the opposite direction from Devil's Peak. If we go there, we can't make Pike's deadline." "Which means he'll assume we're all dead," Jesse added. "He'll come looking for proof." Eliza struggled to her feet, one hand braced against the cave wall for support. The baby was moving constantly, now responding to her elevated stress levels with increasing urgency. She estimated she had perhaps hours left before labor began in earnest. "Then we'd better make sure we have something to show him when he arrives," she said grimly. "What are you thinking?" Nate asked. Eliza picked up the knife, testing its weight in her hand. The blade caught the firelight, throwing dancing shadows on the cave walls. "I'm thinking Pike designed this game to break us, to turn us against each other. But what if we used his own rules against him? What if we gave him exactly what he expects to find, but not in the way he expects to find it?" Understanding dawned in Nate's eyes. "A trap." "The oldest kind," Eliza agreed. "We fake our own deaths, let Pike think he's won, then use his moment of triumph to destroy him." "It's dangerous," Jesse warned. "If Pike suspects anything, then we'll be no worse off than we are now," Eliza replied. "But if it works, we save your mother, stop Pike's operation, and ensure that no one else has to play his games." As the three unlikely allies began planning their desperate gambit, the wind outside the cave carried the distant sound of hunting horns. Pike's men were still out there, still searching, still confident that their prey was running scared through the wilderness. They were about to discover that the hunted had become the hunters, and the game was about to change in ways that Sheriff Pike had never imagined. The knife in Eliza's hand was no longer just a weapon. It was a tool of justice and the beginning of Pike's end. The telegraph station sat in a clearing on the eastern slope of Devil's Peak, a small wooden building connected to the outside world by a single wire that stretched between tall poles marching away through the forest. It had been abandoned for 2 years, ever since the copper mine closed, but the equipment inside was still functional. Pike had made sure of that. They reached it just as the first stars appeared overhead, moving carefully through the shadows to avoid any sentries Pike might have posted. But the station was empty, just as Nate had predicted. Pike was too confident in his game to expect his prey to double back. The interior was sparse, but functional: a desk, with telegraph equipment, a few chairs, and a cabinet containing logbooks and supplies. Most importantly, there was a schedule tacked to the wall showing Pike's communication times with his various contacts. "Tomorrow at midnight," Jesse said, pointing to an entry marked in Pike's distinctive handwriting. "Final confirmation to Denver buyer regarding railroad shipment." Nate examined the telegraph equipment with professional interest. "I can work this. Used to send messages for Pike when he needed to coordinate with contacts in other territories." "Good," Eliza said, settling heavily into one of the chairs. The baby was moving almost constantly now, and she could feel the first hints of the contractions that would signal the beginning of labor. "Because we're going to need to send a very specific message." She outlined her plan as they prepared for Pike's arrival. It was audacious, dangerous, and relied on Pike's arrogance and predictability. But it was also their only chance to turn the tables on a man who had built his power on the suffering of others. The first part required creating evidence of their supposed deaths. Using supplies from the station and their own belongings, they staged a scene that would convince Pike his game had ended as planned. Blood from a cut on Nate's hand clothing torn and scattered to suggest a violent struggle, and finally the knife Eliza had carried planted where Pike would be sure to find it stained with enough blood to tell the story he expected. "He'll want proof," Nate warned as they worked. "Pike never takes anything on faith." "He'll get his proof," Eliza replied grimly. "Just not the kind he's expecting." The second part of the plan required timing and precision. They would hide in the station's storage room and wait for Pike to arrive for his midnight communication with Denver. When he was focused on the telegraph equipment, they would emerge and confront him with the evidence of his crimes. "What if he brings men with him?" Jesse asked. "He won't," Nate said with certainty. "Pike always handles the Denver communications personally. Too much money involved to trust anyone else." As they settled in to wait, Eliza felt another contraction grip her belly stronger this time, lasting nearly a minute before it passed. The baby was coming, and soon. She estimated she had perhaps hours left before the birth became inevitable. "Are you all right?" Jesse asked, noticing her distress. "For now," Eliza replied. "But we need to finish this quickly." The hours passed slowly, marked by the sound of wind in the trees and the distant howling of wolves. Twice they heard riders passing nearby, but no one approached the station. Pike's men were searching the wilderness for bodies, confident that their prey was already dead. At 11:30, they heard the sound they'd been waiting for: a single horse approaching at a steady pace. Through a crack in the storage room door, they watched Pike dismount and enter the station, with the casual confidence of a man who believed himself in complete control. He was alone, just as Nate had predicted. His dark coat was dusted with snow, and his face bore the satisfied expression of a hunter who had successfully concluded a difficult chase. He moved directly to the telegraph equipment, pulling out a sheet of paper covered with coded messages. For 20 minutes, Pike worked at the telegraph key, sending a series of complex communications to his contact in Denver. The messages, transcribed in a logbook he kept beside the equipment, contained all the evidence they needed: dates, times, locations, and financial arrangements for the railroad robbery. It was Eliza who made the decision to act. As Pike finished his final transmission and began preparing to leave, she pushed open the storage room door and stepped into the lamplight at the bloody knife held steadily in her hand. "Hello, Sheriff," she said quietly. Pike spun around his hand, moving instinctively toward his weapon, before stopping as he saw the knife pointed at his chest. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, then a grudging admiration. "Well played," he said finally. "I have to admit, I didn't see this coming." Nate and Jesse emerged from hiding, positioning themselves to block Pike's escape routes. The sheriff took in their arrangement with the eye of a professional, calculating odds and possibilities. "You realize this changes nothing," Pike said conversationally. "Kill me here and my men will hunt you down within hours. They'll assume you ambushed me, and they'll show no mercy." "We're not going to kill you," Eliza said. "We're going to do something much worse." She gestured toward the telegraph equipment where the logbook lay open to Pike's recent communications. "We're going to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you really are." Pike's eyes narrowed as he understood her meaning. "You intercepted my messages." "Every word," Nate confirmed. "Communications with known criminals, plans for robbery, evidence of murder and kidnapping. More than enough to interest federal marshals. And we're going to transmit all of it." Jessie added, her voice strong with newfound courage. "To every law enforcement agency in 3 territories. Pike's laugh was cold. "You think anyone will believe the word of 3 fugitives against a decorated sheriff?" "They will when they have your own words as evidence," Eliza replied. "Written in your hand, transmitted from your personal communication station, documented in your private logbook." For the first time since they'd known him, Pike looked uncertain. His carefully constructed empire of fear and control was crumbling, brought down by the very prey he'd thought to destroy. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "Justice," Eliza said simply. "Starting with Jesse's mother." Pike's smile returned, but it was forced now, desperate. "The woman is already dead, has been for weeks." The lie was too obvious, too cruel to be believed. Jessie stepped forward, her young face hardened by months of fear and suffering. "You're lying," she said. "You always lie when you're cornered." "Am I?" Pike's voice carried a note of genuine malice. "Would you like me to describe her final moments, how she begged for mercy right up until—" He never finished the sentence. Jessie moved faster than anyone expected, covering the distance between them in 2 quick steps. The sound of her hand connecting with Pike's face echoed through the small building like a gunshot. "Enough," Eliza said firmly. "We're not here for revenge. We're here to stop you." But even as she spoke, another contraction gripped her belly stronger than any before, lasting nearly 2 minutes and leaving her gasping for breath. The baby was coming, and there was no stopping it now. "Eliza," Nate said, concern evident in his voice. "I'm fine." She lied, though sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cold. "Just, let's finish this." Pike had been watching her carefully, and now his eyes glittered with renewed confidence. "Having some difficulties, Mrs. Thornfield, seems like poor timing for heroics." "The only poor timing here is yours," Eliza replied, though she had to brace herself against the desk as another wave of pain washed over her. It was then that Pike made his move. With the desperate speed of a cornered animal, he lunged toward Jessie, clearly intending to use her as a human shield. But he had underestimated the girl's reflexes and overestimated his own speed. Jessie twisted away from his grasp, and Pike stumbled forward into Nate's waiting fist. The blow sent Pike reeling backward, blood streaming from his nose. He reached for his gun, but Eliza was already moving the knife, flashing in the lamplight as she stepped between Pike and his weapon. "Don't," she said quietly, the blade steady despite the pain racking her body. Pike froze his hand halfway to his holster. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the telegraph equipment and Eliza's labored breathing. "You won't do it," Pike said finally. "You're not a killer." "No," Eliza agreed. "But I'm a mother protecting her child, and there's nothing more dangerous than that." The certainty in her voice must have convinced him, because Pike slowly raised his hands in surrender. As Nate moved to secure his weapon, Eliza felt another contraction begin stronger than any, before marking the point of no return. The baby was coming, and Pike's reign of terror was finally ending. But the night was far from over, and the most dangerous part of their plan was yet to come. The first federal marshal arrived at dawn, followed by 3 more within the hour. Nate's telegraph messages had reached sympathetic lawmen in Colorado Territory, and they had ridden hard through the night to reach the remote station on Devil's Peak. By then, Eliza Morrison had given birth to a daughter. The labor had been difficult, complicated by exhaustion, stress, and the primitive conditions of the telegraph station. But Jessie had proven surprisingly capable as a midwife, and Nate had kept Pike securely bound while maintaining watch for any of the sheriff's men who might come looking for their leader. The baby was small, but healthy, with dark hair and strong lungs that announced her arrival to the world with impressive volume. Eliza held her daughter against her chest, feeling a peace she hadn't known in months, despite the chaos surrounding them. "What will you name her?" Jessie asked softly, her young face transformed by wonder at the new life. "Hope," Eliza said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." Pike, bound and gagged in the corner of the room, watched the proceedings with eyes that held equal measures of rage and defeat. The evidence against him was overwhelming, his own logbook, filled with incriminating communications and testimony from 3 witnesses who had experienced his crimes firsthand. Marshal William Hayes, a grizzled veteran with 30 years of frontier law enforcement behind him, examined the telegraph equipment with professional interest. "This is quite a setup," he said admiringly. "Pike's been using federal communication lines to coordinate criminal activities across 3 territories. That's enough for a federal case right there." "What about his men?" Nate asked. "There are at least a dozen of them scattered through these mountains." "We'll round them up," Hayes promised. "With Pike in custody and his communication network compromised, they'll be easy to track. Most of them will probably scatter once word gets out that their leader's been arrested." "And the people he's been hunting?" Jessie asked. "The families he's torn apart." Hayes's expression grew grim. "We'll do everything we can to bring them justice. But I won't lie to you, some of Pike's crimes go back years. We may never find all the victims." As the marshals prepared to transport Pike to Denver for trial, Eliza found herself thinking about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd fled one form of brutality only to encounter another, but in the end, she had not only survived, she had fought back. "Mrs. Morrison?" Marshal Hayes said, approaching her carefully. "We're going to need your testimony about Pike's activities. Are you willing to testify at his trial?" "Yes," Eliza said firmly. "Whatever it takes to make sure he never hurts anyone else." "There's one more thing." Hayes continued. Your husband, Marcus Thornfield, filed a warrant for your arrest. Technically, I should be taking you back to face those charges. Eliza's blood ran cold, but before she could respond, Nate stepped forward. With respect, Marshal Mrs. Morrison is under federal protection as a key witness in the Pike case. Any local warrants would have to wait until after the federal trial. Hayes studied Nate thoughtfully. That's an interesting interpretation of federal law, Mr. Cross. But accurate, Nate replied. I spent 3 years learning Pike's methods. I know where the bodies are buried literally and figuratively. The federal case against Pike depends on complete cooperation from all surviving witnesses. And if that cooperation were to be compromised by local interference, it would jeopardize the entire prosecution. Nate finished. Hayes smiled, the first genuine expression of humor they'd seen from him. You make a compelling argument, Mr. Cross. I think the federal case should definitely take precedence. As the marshals led Pike away, the defeated sheriff looked back at Eliza one final time. His eyes held no remorse, only cold calculation, as if he were already planning his next move. This isn't over, he said quietly, his voice carrying despite the gag they'd placed over his mouth during transport. But Eliza Morrison, holding her newborn daughter in the morning sunlight, felt no fear. She had faced the worst kind of predator and emerged victorious. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would meet them with the strength of a woman who had learned to fight for what mattered most. Yes, she said loud enough for Pike to hear. It is. 3 weeks later, Eliza stood on the platform of the Denver train station holding hope, while Nate secured their luggage and travel documents. They were bound for California, where Nate had family who could help them start new lives under new names. Jesse had chosen to stay in Colorado, accepting an offer from Marshal Hayes to help identify other victims of Pike's organization. The girl who had once been a terrified pawn in Pike's games had grown into a young woman determined to see justice done. Are you sure about this? Eliza asked Nate as they waited for their train. You could stay here, help with the investigation. Make sure Pike pays for everything he's done. Nate shook his head. Pike will get what he deserves. But I've spent too many years looking backward, trying to atone for past mistakes. It's time to look forward. And you think California is the answer? I think California is a beginning, he corrected. A place where hope can grow up without the shadows of our past hanging over her. As their train pulled into the station, Eliza reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She had started as a victim, running from one form of abuse, only to encounter another. But somewhere in the wilderness, between Copper Creek and Devil's Peak, she had stopped running and started fighting. The woman who boarded that train was not the same person who had fled Marcus Thornfield's ranch 3 months earlier. She was stronger, wiser, and no longer willing to let fear define her choices. But as the train pulled away from the platform, carrying them toward their new life, Eliza noticed a familiar figure watching from the crowd. A man in a dark coat standing too still among the bustle of travelers and well-wishers. The man raised his hat in a mocking salute, and she caught a glimpse of his face scarred, weathered with the cold eyes of someone who had spent years learning patience. One of Pike's men. Still loyal, still hunting. The game, it seemed, was far from over. But as Eliza Morrison settled back in her seat, her daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, and the man she loved sitting beside her, she felt no fear. She had learned something important in those desperate days in the mountains. Sometimes the hunted must become the hunter, and sometimes the only way to end a game is to change the rules entirely. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would meet them as she had met Pike, with courage, cunning, and the unbreakable will of a mother protecting her child. The train carried them west toward the setting sun and the promise of a new beginning. Behind them, the mountains of Colorado faded into memory, but the lessons learned there would stay with them forever. Hope Morrison Cross would grow up knowing that her mother had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, that her father had found redemption in choosing love over revenge, that justice, though sometimes delayed, would ultimately prevail. And if the shadows of the past ever caught up with them again, they would face them together, not as victims, but as survivors who had learned to fight back. The hunt was over. The healing could begin. But in the distance, carried on the wind from the mountains they were leaving behind, came the faint sound of hunting horns. Some games, Eliza Morrison knew, never truly end. They simply wait for the next players to take their positions on the board.